We are going to begin working on factoring polynomials. So I want to give you a little introduction to what it is. So we were previously multiplying polynomials slash binomials, and this is what our end result looked like. Now we're going to go in the reverse. So we're going to factor this polynomial so that it looks like this. So suppose we started with this polynomial, and we have it in general form that I have an ax squared plus bx plus c. We are going to eventually use a form called slide divide, and we're going to work on finding the factors today using this graphic organizer, which is just a giant X. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to slide this first number over and multiply it with our last number. So currently, since there's no number right here, there's actually an invisible one. So I'm going to put that in there. I'm going to want to multiply 1 times 3, and that would be my number that I would put at the top of my X. Okay? And then what we're going to do is we're going to put the b term, which is this number in the middle, it's going to go on the bottom. Now the reason we're doing this is because we have to figure out what numbers to put in place of here so that again I end up looking like this guy. So what you have to do is you first have to slide like we did, set up your bottom organizer, and now we're going to find all the factors of 3. So on your factor sheet you would list out that all my factors are just 1 and 3. So I'm finding a pair that would add or subtract to equal 3. Well, obviously since this is the only pair, my answers are 1 and 3. So I would put in my numbers 1 and 3, and then I would figure out what my signs would be. So Mr. Gahan and I figured out some different sign rules that you might be able to use. So I would encourage you to copy this down maybe in your Chapter 8 note packet and use this when you get ready to do your sign rules. So if my top number is positive and my bottom number is positive, then obviously everything else is going to be positive. If my top number is positive and my bottom number is negative, then that means these two will be negative. If I have negative and negative, you're going to put the negative on the bigger number and then put the positive on the smaller number. And if it's vice versa, where I have negative positive, then I'll put the positive on the bigger number and then the negative. What this does is this helps you figure out what your signs are. So instead of me trying to explain how I'm going to multiply to a positive but I need to add to a positive, this might help you figure it out. So I would strongly encourage you to write this down somewhere in your Chapter 8 note packet so that you have it. So you might put it at the top of 8.5 since that's what this section is about. So since everything was positive, that's how we end up with those plus signs. Okay? So again, we are just going to focus on finding the numbers that you would actually use. So we're going to focus on just doing this graphic organizer today. So you should have a worksheet where it has all of these X's and you have to figure out what you're going to plug into them, right? So on this first one, it gives you 9 and negative 6. So what I would need to do is list out all the factors of 9. So I have 1 and 9, 3 and 3. I'm going to add and subtract each pair until I figure out which one comes up with 6. So if I add 1 and 9, I get 10. If I subtract 1 and 9, I get 8. Doesn't work. If I add 3 and 3, I get 6. If I subtract, I get 0. This is my pair that adds to 6, so therefore I would use 3 and 3 for my two numbers. So I would put in 3 and 3, and then I would check my signs. So I go back to my sign rules. Since the top one is positive and the bottom one is negative, then both of my numbers have to end up being negative. Okay? Let's try another one. So on this second one, we have 4 and 4. So I want to list all of my factors of 4. So I listed 1 and 4 and 2 and 2. So again, I'm going to go through and I'm going to add and subtract until I come up with a pair that comes up with 4. 1 and 4 added is 5. 1 and 4 subtracted is 3, so that doesn't work. 2 and 2 added is 4. When I subtract them, it's 0. So that works as being 4, so I'm going to use 2 and 2. And then since everything is positive on the top and the bottom, then that means that I would put positives on both of those signs. Let's try one more together. So this one I have negative 30, and I have, sorry, I'm trying to cover it up so you can't see, a negative 30 on top and negative 13 on the bottom. So I list all of the factors of 30. 1 and 30, 2 and 15, 3 and 10, 5 and 6. I'm looking for a pair that will add or subtract to 13. So I start going through. 1 plus 30 is 31. When I subtract, I get 29, so that's out. 2 plus 15 is 17. When I subtract, it's 13. Bingo, I just found my answer. Now, sometimes there are 2 pairs that work for it, so I would encourage you to keep working just to double check, because if you look on this one, if I add these 2, I get 13. If I subtract, I get 7. And then if I keep going, if I have 11 and 7, this one is out. So notice that you have 2 pairs that add up to 13. So, or add or subtract, I should say. So what you have to do is you have to look at your signs. My top one was negative and my bottom one was negative. So that means the bigger number is going to have to be negative and the smaller number is going to have to be positive. So if I look at my stuff here, I would have to have negative 15, or I would have to have the 10 be negative according to my sign rules. So in this case, if I put the negatives in here, now notice that when I add 3 and negative 10, that gives me negative 7. But when I add these 2, it gives me negative 13. That's how I know I end up using the 2 and the 15 for my pair. So again, you can double check to make sure all of them work. Every once in a while, there are 2 pairs that will do it, and so it will depend on your signs. But most of the time you can find it by just stopping after the first, but you might double check to make sure you have it correct. So I want you to pause the video and try the next one. On the next one, you are looking for a pair that has negative 84, so it multiplies to negative 84, and then adds or subtracts to 5. So I listed all of my pairs over here, and I found that when I do 7 plus 12, I get 19, but when I subtract, I get 5. So I used 7 and 12, and then I went to my sign rules. I have a negative on the top and a positive on the bottom. So my bigger number has to be positive. So I put positive 12 over here, and then I put negative 7 on the other side. Okay, so you're going to finish the rest of these puzzles on the front and the back as your homework. So just practicing finding what those numbers are. And again, I would encourage you to use these sign rules. So make sure that you've written them down somewhere because they are not on Canvas. Okay, so make sure you've written them down so you kind of have a cheat sheet to help you figure out what the signs are.